haven't spent a lot of time doing yet is thinking through what soft skills youth themselves think are important, what soft skills they value. So YouthPower wanted to know, what do they value, and is there a gap between what the youth value and what employers want and what educators want? So our research starts right at that point. And in a moment, we'll get a little bit more specific about the research design and data collection, but that, have I captured that? Yeah.
Okay, and I think we have Gabriel on online. Annie's also online, and I think she is muted, but we can't quite see her yet, so it should just take a second. Gabriel, can you hear us, and can you try to say something?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. And here comes Annie. Perfect. So I'll leave it to you guys to get started, and we have your slide deck up. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just gave a quick overview of YouthPower's goals and putting out this research. So I'm Rebecca. I have been working on the research along with Annie, who is based in Rwanda. She's the woman on the screen. And then Gabriel has been, he is a PhD student at the University of Ulm in Germany. And he is studying quantitative psychology. So he's been our psychometrician on the project, and also just an advisor for how we handle and analyze and interpret the findings. So I just want to give you an overview of our presentation today.
Yeah.
So we'll just start with talking about the research questions that we asked and to do this study, the tool that we used, the different data collection activities that we engaged in, and then we'll talk through some questions that we want you to be thinking through, questions to ponder throughout the presentation. And then Gabriel will lead you through a discussion of the findings from the quantitative portion of the study. And finally, we'll spend a little time workshopping the findings. And you can see some of the flip chart pages around the room. We'll spend some time thinking through what all the findings mean. All right, so as I mentioned just a little bit ago, YouthPower's idea was to ask the youth what they thought what soft skills they thought were important. So we used a tool that we had developed in a previous study that we have called the Anchored BFI, and there's examples of those on the table for you. Please don't take those copies with you, but you're welcome to look through them. And we thought, well, we can give this tool to youth, and we can ask the youth to self-assess their own soft skills. And we can also ask them to use that tool to tell us what they think the ideal employee's soft skills look like. And then we can also ask them to tell us what they think the ideal student's soft skills look like. And at the same time, we can ask employers to tell us which soft skills they think the ideal employee has, and which soft skills for educators they think the ideal student has. So once we got all this data, so once we discovered employers' ideal soft skills for the ideal employee, and once we discovered educators' ideal soft skills for the ideal students, we could look at the gap between what youth said was ideal for employment and ideal for education, and between what their employers and educators said. So our discussion today is going to focus on these two pieces. What did youth say were the ideal soft skills for employment, and what did employers say were the ideal soft skills, and is there a gap? And similarly, what did youth say are the ideal soft skills for a student, and what did educators say were the ideal soft skills for a student? And at the same time, we were able to look at the soft skills that you said were ideal and the soft skills that they actually have to see if there's a gap there.
Mm.
So those are the three main pieces that we'll talk about today. Are there any questions on that? Sometimes it feels like a tongue twister of ideal and soft skill, and does it make sense to everybody? Annie?
Annie, I think you're still muted. There we go.
Okay, I think that should work.
Yes.
There we go. Trying to balance the technology here. So, good morning, everyone. And I'm Annie. I am assisting Rebecca in this research, and I'm based in Rwanda. So I've been leading the Rwanda part of the data collection. And I just want to add to what Rebecca has talked about with our research questions to go into some details on the tool that we used. As she mentioned, we are building off of a tool that was in existence before. It was developed under the Workforce Connections grant that we received, and through USAID funding as well. But what we've done is we've adapted the tool to the research questions that Rebecca just walked you through. And there's three types of questions on what we're calling the anchored BFI tool. And is anyone here familiar with the Big Five inventory? I guess if you could raise your hands if anyone is familiar with that tool. Excellent. Okay. So the Big Five inventory, the main concern about that is the self-assessment bias. And so a few of the different types of questions that we decided to develop in collaboration with our testing partner is anchoring vignettes and situational judgment tests. So for the anchored BFI tool that we're using for this research, we actually did shorten it a little bit because for the youth in the sample, the reading level was a bit difficult for them, so we wanted to make it manageable. And so we cut it down to 5 anchoring vignettes and 4 situational judgment tests. And both the anchoring vignettes and the situational judgment tests are trying to give youth scenarios to try to understand beyond their self-assessment how they would use and how they would rate others in these various soft skills. In the 5 facets that you see below, which are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. For the data collection activities, we have been collecting information in 3 countries. And these countries were not randomly selected. They were selected because the 3 areas of, even the Philippines, it's in Muslim Mindanao, these 3 areas are conflict affected or post-conflict areas. And this is building off of findings we had in the first phase of the research and trying to look at soft skills in these specific contexts. And the first round of data collection was administering the survey, the anchored BFI with the BFI 44, the situational judgment tests, and the anchoring vignettes. And so our questions are looking at what soft skills do youth have and value? So asking them to first of all do their self-assessment, but then saying, okay, think about your ideal student or the ideal employee. What soft skills rate that ideal student or that ideal employee? And then the second part is, that is the second part. What are the gaps, between youth ideal soft skills and employers and educators? So not only did we survey youth in this data collection, but we also then surveyed their teachers and employers who are employing this the same population of youth that we're interested in. So we wanted to look at the different, give them the same tool, but ask them to think about their ideal student or their ideal employee and from their perspective rate those people. The second activity that we did, which was really fun, I led this activity in Rwanda, was a photography activity. So teaching them a little bit about photography, but then also giving them the assignment of photographing soft skills in action. And we want youth to tell us, what do these soft skills look like in your community, in your school, in your peers? Take photographs, candid, we don't want a lot of selfies was our goal. Take photographs, and then the next step will be to have them talk about their photos once they're developed, and to have focus group discussions with them, which is very soon to come. So understanding in these photos, why did they take this picture? What does this mean to them? And splitting them into groups by gender to try to understand as well if these ideals or these perceptions are different between genders. And this is where we are. So we have we completed the photography activity, and we're yet to do the focus group discussions in all 3 countries. But right now, the focus of today is really making sense of what we have already, and to try to get your ideas so we can have even more rich focus group discussions. Back to you, Rebecca.
No, it's
Okay, that's okay. You have these on your handout.
I think it sometimes happens when you upload and there's a graphing in that way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you probably see it on the computer.
So you have the questions that we want you to ponder throughout the presentation are also replicated in your handout. Does everybody have a handout? Are there extras lying around?
Here, sorry.
Everyone now has one? So throughout the presentation, as I mentioned earlier, the real goal of this is to make meaning out of the findings together. So there are 6 key questions that the quantitative data that we'll discuss today answers. And those 6 key questions are the 6 questions that are bolded here on these 3 pages. You can see the first one is, how do youth compare to their own ideals, and so on. And throughout the presentation, you'll see these questions appear in the PowerPoint slides that Gabriel will share with us. So whenever you see one of these questions appear, shortly after you'll see a bunch of charts and figures to help you answer the question. And we've given you some of the most key charts right here on this handout. So the goal of this handout is to help you to process all this information so that you can organize it for yourself as we go through, so that by the time we're done, you know the answers to these questions. Because after the presentation, what we want to do is spend time discussing the questions that appear in these boxes. These are the questions that will help us to make meaning out of the finding. So what does this finding mean? Why do you think a particular relationship exists? Those kinds of things. So as we go through the presentation, look for these questions. Try to process the information. If you have a question, something's not making sense to you, feel free to ask, and we can clarify it. Because the goal by the end of the presentation is that you know what we found, so then we can go on and discuss it together. So before we jump into the findings, those questions are, the first one is, how do youth compare to their own ideals? The second one is, do employers and educators look for different traits in youth? So do they think that different soft skills are important for education and for employment? The third one is, do youth fulfill employers' ideals? So do youth self-ratings and do youth ideals agree with what the employer said were ideal soft skills? The fourth question is, do youth fulfill educators' ideals? So similarly, do youth self-ratings and youth ideals for education match with educators' ideals for education? The fifth question is, do ideal traits or ideal soft skills differ across different work fields? So we thought maybe depending on the field of work you're going into, you might value different soft skills. So we wanted to know the answer to that question. And then finally, do ideal soft skills, question 6, do ideal soft skills differ for students in TVETs in vocational schools or students in general secondary schools? So those are the 6 key questions that you'll be able to answer with the data that Gabriel will shortly present to you. And afterwards, we'll process those answers together. Any questions?
So just to clarify, the questions that are here are not the questions that were actually asked to the students or the
Yeah.
employers. This is just the questions for us to answer today.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. What you have in your hand, would you hold that up for everybody? Is there's just a few samples of the tool that we used in the quantitative portion of the study. On the table, the tool is called the Anchored BFI, and there are some examples there for you to look at. If you just want to see how we ask some questions or so on and so forth. But these are just for you to help you process the information that we'll present. So. Okay. All right. Gabriel, who is our psychometrician, will now share the findings. So, Gabriel.
Hi, I'm Gabriel. I'm gonna walk you through our findings. First off, this is a brief overview of the sample we gathered for our study. So roughly 700 students, youth participated, and over half of them were still studying. 93 employers participated and 111 educators. On average, the students were about 20 years old. And first of all, can you see the bar graph? I can't see the figure on the slide.
Daniel, can you just share the presentation? It's just the uploaded one.
I can.
When you just share your screen, that might work
Sure.
better.
Give me just 1 second, Gabriel. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Like this.
Oh, there you go. That's easier.
So, okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Here, first of all, we just wanted to make sure that there are no differences between the male and female part of the sample, because otherwise we would have to disaggregate by gender throughout the analysis. So I'm going to give you a brief explanation on how to interpret a bar graph like this. On the left, we have the scale, which ranges from 1 to 7. The bars depict the mean scale values for the groups on each of the big 5. Just note that we recoded neuroticism to emotional stability, so that all 5 factors would be in line regarding their appearance, because neuroticism is kind of a negative, has a negative touch. So we recoded that so that higher values similar to conscientiousness would maybe be more useful. So over here, can you see my cursor? Okay, over here we see the standard error bars, and these give you our indexes of precision, of measurement precision, and they're very helpful at interpreting findings in regard to their significance. Usually, if those measurement error bars overlap, the results are not significant, which means that any difference you would see is probably random. Whereas in the case of emotional stability, where the 2 measurement error bars don't overlap, you can assume that this is a meaningful difference. It's just this way we can separate meaningful differences from ones that are probably caused by chance or where we are not certain. So as we can see, Males and females scored the same on conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness. And there were some slight differences on emotional stability and extraversion, but the differences were really small, so we didn't disaggregate by gender in the following analysis. So we asked youth to rate themselves and then also provide their ideals on how an ideal employee or how an ideal student should be. And now we're going to look at the differences between the self-ratings and ideals and see how the pattern changes, how high the differences are, etc. So in this figure, you can see the self-ratings in blue, ideal employee in green, and the ideal student ratings in gray. And the first thing you can see is that conscientiousness and agreeableness were scored higher, overall higher than the other three factors. But you can also see that the differences between the self-ratings and ideals were really small. Like they're very small on each factor, and also the ideal employee rating is basically the same as the ideal student ratings, and there are no significant differences between the two ideal ratings. And this is really interesting because as we go on, we will see that the self-ratings and ideals are very similar.
So Gabriel,
so for example, if
can I just ask you a question? So just
yeah, sure.
the graph, because I think that's the first graph, right, on our printed. So what this bar means is that, just to make sure I interpret it correctly, that youth self-rated conscientiousness at the level of 4.25 or so.
Correct.
In terms of how important that skill is, or no, how good they are at that skill. Is that correct? The self-rating meant how good they are at that skill. And then...
Correct.
Yeah, okay. And then the ideal employee, how they rated the idea, what they thought the ideal employee should have, and what they thought the ideal student should have, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, so just to give you an idea of where the small difference come from, we looked at the distribution of the difference. In this case, for conscientiousness, the difference between the ideal employee rating and how the youth rated themselves. On the bottom, you can see the difference from the ideal to the self-rating. And over here on the left, you can see the number of youth that per difference. So first of all, over 120 youth did not change their ideal rating compared to their self-rating at all. So their ideal employee conscientiousness rating was the same as their own self-rating. And about half of the sample have a higher ideal employee rating than their own self-rating, but as you can see, most of the differences are rather small. Over here, like there's only a very small percentage of differences higher by 1. And this here should provide a quick overview of all the factors, but basically just to sum it up, the pattern you saw beforehand was the same across all 5 factors. On average, the ideal scores are about 0.1 to 0.2 higher, and the middle here is the middle is where half of the sample are separated. So half of the sample have a higher ideal rating of conscientiousness by 0.1 or more, and half of the sample have a higher rating of 0.1 or less. So basically, the patterns you saw beforehand repeated across all 5 vectors. If we look at the correlations between the self-ratings and the ideal ratings here, and both ideal ratings with each other, we can see that the correlations are really high, and they're close to 1, which means that when a youth rates himself as highly conscientious, his ideal ratings of an ideal employee or ideal student are also going to be high on conscientiousness. If he's personally low on conscientiousness, he's going to rate ideal employees and ideal students also low. And these correlations are really high, so we can see how similar the ideal ratings are to the self-ratings. Down here, we can see the correlation of the shapes, which means that with shape, I refer to what traits they value above others. So, for example, a shape could be he valued conscientiousness most, then agreeableness, and emotional stability, openness, and extroversion about the same. And the correlations between the self-ratings and the ideals are 0.8, which is also very high. And this indicates again that their self-ratings kind of transfers into their ideal ratings. They're very, very similar. Whereas they're not so similar when it comes to correlating them with the employer and educator ideal. You can see the correlations here are around 0.3 compared to 0.8 when looking at the youth's ratings. So to summarize this, the self-ratings and ideals are nearly identical, but the ideals are slightly higher on average than the self-ratings. However, the two ideals there are no significant differences in the two ideals. So the youth rated ideal employees the same way they rated ideal students. So there was no differentiation in any factor. So now we are going to look at employers and educators, and we're going to see what their ideal employee or ideal student would be. And over here we compare the employers' ideal employee ratings to educators' ideal student ratings. And as you can see, they're both the ratings are the same on conscientiousness and also the same on emotional stability. But on the other hand, employers look for more agreeableness in their employees and a little bit more extroversion, whereas educators want their students to be more open. So these are the differences between the profiles that employers and educators look for. If we compare the employers to the youth ratings, so we see the youth self-rating in blue, the youth ideal employee rating in green, and the employer ideal employee rating in gray. And we can see a pattern across all 5 factors. The youth ideals are somewhat higher than the self-ratings, as we learned earlier, but the employer ideals are always higher than both youth self-ratings and youth ideals. This is true for all 5 factors, and most of all for emotional stability. This is the largest difference in this case, but yeah, there's a significant difference on all 5 factors. Looking at the ideal student rating, so again we compare youth to educators, we can see the same pattern repeat with the exception of agreeableness. So the youth fulfill the expectations of educators when it comes to agreeableness, but again we have a large gap on emotional stability. And in this case, also a large gap in openness. So educators would want their ideal students to be much higher in openness than the youth are, or than the youth think an ideal student should be. Also note the difference in conscientiousness, which is also somewhat substantial. So to summarize this part, employers and educators both value conscientiousness and emotional stability. While educators value openness more, employers value agreeableness and extroversion more. So these are the traits they're kind of looking for. And as we saw, youth fell below the ideal ratings on nearly all factors in both cases. I ordered the factors by the size of the difference. So openness was the biggest difference, followed by emotional stability, and openness for the ideal student ratings, followed by emotional stability and conscientiousness in both cases, and extroversion and agreeableness when it comes to the ideal employee. We wanted to check if the findings are consistent across work fields, because we were expecting that ideal employees that would change depending on what field you were working in. So what we did was divide the jobs into 3 big work fields: production or manufacturing, and then direct service, and business. The business in this case is only accounting, finance, and ICT or telecommunications. Okay, and now we're going to look at the differences depending on those disaggregated by those 3 work fields. So first of all, since we divided the samples into 3 parts, you need to keep in mind that the measurement precision is a little bit lower, since now instead of being 90 employers, it's roughly 20 to 40 per group. So that's why you see the standard error is larger. But basically, what we can see here, what is most obvious is that the direct service group and the business service group, they're both higher on conscientiousness than production, whereas differences between those 2 groups aren't significant. Also, the differences to the profile, to the ideal profile, aren't as large. And you can kind of see this pattern. Oh yeah?
Can I just ask you a question again? So the student responses are still the same across the board, because you didn't ask them specifically about the ideal employee in production or the ideal employee in direct services. That's the same. The only difference is the answers from the employers, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't clarify this. So you were asked what field they were currently working in, or what field they would like to work in. And Rebecca, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. And then we asked them to rate the ideal employee in that field. Is that right? Or in that job?
Yes, that's it. You got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yes, as you can see, self-ratings and ideals are overall lowest on production, which is what is interesting about it, that this is also the case for the employers' ratings. So, regarding conscientiousness, the expectations concerning conscientiousness are not as high as in the direct and business service group. And this is we see the same For agreeableness, again, direct and business are very similar when it comes to the employer's ideal employee, whereas production is overall lowest. And in the case of emotional stability, the biggest gap can be found for the direct service group, whereas the other two groups, production and business, have somewhat lower expectations regarding emotional stability. Again, the business group scored lowest, which you can find across all 5 factors. And for extroversion, the differences are again similar to emotional stability, only substantial in the direct group. So the difference between youth self-ratings and employer's ideal employee. So to summarize this section, again, production ideals were overall the lowest. The employer's ideals, and direct service had the highest requirements to emotional stability and extroversion, and that's where we also found the highest gaps between youth and employers. So there is an influence of work fields on the ideals. Now keep in mind that since the employer groups were relatively small, most of the findings were not significant. Okay, and yes, again, the production group scored lowest, and business group had the somewhat highest self-ratings, the somewhat highest youth self-ratings. And the last section is on different school types. So now we were comparing technical vocational schools to general secondary school regarding the youth self-ratings and what educators would like to see in their students. So, and again, similar to previously, students were asked what kind of school they went to or what school they would like to go to, and based on that they rated their ideal students. So overall, what we can see in these findings on conscientiousness, the educators' ideal are the same across schools, but youth in general school rated themselves and their ideals higher on conscientiousness than youth in technical school. And we can see this pattern across all factors. The educators' ideals are very similar across school types, but youth that are in general school rate themselves higher on the traits. And here for openness, this is actually the only factor where the youth self-ratings in general school were lower than educators' expectations. But again, educators' ideals were the same across school types. So as we saw, the educators, I just presented the 3 out of those 5 factors which had the most interesting results. And as we could see, the educators' ideals were similar across the school types, and youth in general school rated themselves, and based on that, their ideals systematically higher than youth in technical school. And the only gap in general school between youth and educators' ideal could be found for openness, whereas on technical school, there was a gap for all factors. So an overall summary, we think that youth based their ideals on their own self. A possible explanation we tried to come up with is the implicit trait policy, which is a theory that having experience with your own trait and personality gives you an idea of its efficiency. So people that are introverted and see how that trait has been useful in some situations will probably think that being introverted is a good trait to have when facing problems. And that's just an example for how people can interpret their own personality and shape the perceived efficiency of those traits. So, oh yeah, there it is. And regarding employers and educators, employers and educators both value conscientiousness and emotional stability most. Both valued it highly. Educators look for more openness in their students, and employers look for more agreeableness in their employees. And the differences were between the youth and the employer-educator ideals were highest on conscientiousness, emotional stability in both cases, and openness for the ideal student. But these discrepancies can differ between the different work fields, as we saw, regarding to emotional stability and extroversion in direct service. Okay, that's the end of my section.
Thanks, Gabriel.
I'm sorry it took me longer than planned.
No, that's great. Good. So we're going to move into the activity part of the day, the workshop piece. You can move forward on that.
Oh.
I can start explaining. So what we're going to do now is around the room there are there's 5 flip chart pages up on the wall, and there's one down at the end of the table. So what we're going to do, so each of these flip charts has some questions that you've already seen before. So the question underlined are the 6 questions that you have on your handout, and the 6 questions that we built the presentation around. So for example, this one is, how do you compare to their own ideals? And then right beneath that underlined key question is the answer that Gabriel gave us in the presentation. And you also have some data on your handout that also answers that question. And then what we want you to do on the page right here is answer the bolded question on the bottom, which is the one that's going to help us to think through what the meaning is of this finding. Right? So I'll ask you to get into, so we want about 5 groups. So 5 groups of no more than 5 people. And then your group can just go to any one of these flip charts. And you can talk about it, think about what your experiences bring to bear on the findings. And then on the flip chart, before you leave it, just write down your reactions, your answers to this question. And then whenever you're done with that flip chart, you can move on to an empty flip chart. So there's 5 groups, 6 flip charts. Roughly, we should be able to move when we're ready to an empty flip chart. If you come to a flip chart that already has writing on it, read over what's there, react to it. You can write reactions to what's there. You can put stars next to things that really resonate with you. So this is just our way of brainstorming and processing the sometimes really specific and certainly several findings that we've shared with you already. Any questions about this?
Not about the activity, but a broader question. Was there any difference between the 3 countries that were significant in terms of how youth sort of rated themselves, or in any of those categories?
Yeah. Gabriel, did you hear that? Gabriel, did you hear that question?
Yes.
Shubha, do you want to repeat?
Well, oh, no, I heard the question. Thank you. So before the anchoring, there were really big differences between the countries, and after anchoring, those differences were reduced. Most of them weren't significant anymore, but there were still some differences on some factors, but they weren't systematic. So there was no way of telling if it was a cultural effect or if it was just the sample we collected in that country, or whether it depended on their how far they were into their education. So it's kind of hard to say. Rebecca, if you want, I can also show the graphs. But
If you think they're helpful, sure.
And also just chime in and say if there are
I'm not
any
sure I can find it.
for us, please feel free before we go into groups. While you have us both on the line, please feel free to ask questions before we jump into the group activity.
I have similar questions, maybe following up around the 700 students. What is the distribution across the 3 countries? And then any significant differences across gender, both generally and then country specifically?
So their differences on the gender were very small, and like on most traits there were no differences, and I think on emotional stability and extroversion there were very small differences that were hardly substantial. So I would basically say there are no differences between genders. And regarding countries, this here, just give me a second. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have a graph on the differences between youth self-ratings across countries. This is a graph on the employers' ideals, where you can see that the ideals in the Philippines were systematically smaller, but then you got to keep in mind that these are samples of around 20 employers per country, so there's a lot of chance and randomness involved. So these results should be interpreted with caution. For example, the differences in agreeableness are not significant between the Philippines and Rwanda because of the measurement precision, but I wouldn't want to go into that much detail because it's kind of dangerous to interpret findings just based on very small sample sizes. And when looking at the educators' ideals across countries, the pattern does not replicate the pattern we saw earlier. So it's not, we can't say for sure whether this was a cultural effect that people in the Philippines use the scale differently than people in Honduras and Rwanda. So I think we need larger sample sizes to answer that question.
Gabriel, I have another question related to that. I know that the same survey wasn't administered in other countries, but based on your experience with similar surveys, would you say that it seems that all the ratings are between like 4 and 5, which surprised me a little bit that there wasn't a little bit more variation from the employer's perspective. And I was wondering if you saw kind of similar ratings in other countries when you did other surveys. And I'm not, I know that it's not necessarily comparable.
Okay, so just to make sure, so your question is why the ideal ratings weren't higher as they currently are.
Or just
Is that-
more variation, because it seems that they're all kind of very consistent and they're all in that small range of like 4 to 5, as opposed to, I might have expected that there might be more variance, like that some might say 6 or 7, and others might say 3. It doesn't seem that there's a lot of difference.
yeah, that's there actually is a lot of difference when looking at the individuals. We were surprised to see that the spread in the responses was about the same for employers and youth. So even employers have very different perceptions of what an ideal employer would be, or educators what an ideal student should be. Now over here we can only see the means and the overall mean. So it's hard to tell from here how much variation there is inside the sample. When it comes to comparing the mean scores with other findings, you need to keep in mind that usually, like most of the studies we do don't have the anchoring, so scales range typically from 1 to 5, and most of the times it's different instruments, so it's kind of hard to explain. Hard to answer the question. What you might want to keep in mind is that the difference between, for example, conscientiousness, agreeableness to, let's say, extroversion of 1 full point is relatively high, because as I think that is a very high difference when it comes to like rules of thumb.
And also, Gabriel, I'll just chime in and say that the maximum is a 5 on the scale, correct?
Yeah, so let me just clarify a little bit about the anchoring that Gabriel was referring to, and the 5-point Likert scale that Annie's referring to. So one of the problems in soft skill measurement is that it's so perception based, and that's especially a problem when you're looking across several different countries, because then you have the problem of cultural reference bias, where people have different cultural points of reference about how these skills are expressed. So we added in a new item type called an anchoring vignette that Annie mentioned at the beginning. It was one of the three types of questions we had in there. And what this question type does is that it allows us to correct for that cultural reference bias. And I can go into the mechanics of it, and it'll take a little bit to explain, but essentially what it does is spreads that 5-point Likert scale along a 7-point scale. And I'm happy to explain the mechanics of it later, and Gabriel can do a much better job than I can of explaining the mechanics of it, but it corrects for that cultural reference bias and spreads the scale. So the truth is, it's very hard to get a 7, because things have to work perfectly to get a 7. Very hard to get a 1, because things have to work perfectly to spread your score out to a 1. So it does mean you usually see it. Gabriel, correct me if I'm wrong, but those extremes are pretty hard to find when you do anchoring. So it's not surprising that we'll see the score is a little bit closer. But as Gabriel said, there was still variation within the sample, but you can only see the average ratings there. But does that explain the 7 and 5 and yeah? Gabriel, do you want to clarify or ask?
I'm sorry?
To clarify or add to that, or is that true?
No, you were absolutely right. It's nearly impossible to get a 1 or 7. So typically the values range from 2 to 6. That's where they fall in between. So a 5 is reasonably high.
terms of the size of the organizations they represent, if they're local businesses or if they're multinationals, and then also the profiles of the individuals who, excuse me, who participated, whether they were direct line managers or whether they were higher up and perhaps a little more disconnected from the workforce.
And do you want to answer that question?
Sure, I can do that. So if I heard correctly, it's a question about exactly who the employers were, what sorts of companies, and then who from those companies did we interview, correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So first of all, the employers are, well, the 3 projects in the 3 countries were the ones to have access to these employers. So it's really reflective of employers that would be the ones to take our beneficiaries as interns or as future employees. So so basically they're local, mostly local, and actually it was surprising that a lot of them were also small local level government offices, so like a city hall or a local health clinic, things like that. That actually a lot of our youth end up interning and being employed at the local government level. And then what we tried to do is make every effort to give the survey to somebody who knows our youth, who knows our programs and basically the objectives of what we're trying to do of improving youth workforce development. So definitely someone who would be working the direct supervisor of the lower, the entry level or the junior level employees of the company.
Just to understand, no private sector.
Not necessarily. It depended on the country. Like in the Philippines, we would have had, but I mean small local businesses, not large by any sense of the word. So some government, some private, depending on the country and context. Do you want to speak to Honduras?
Just that in Honduras, I worked on this with Metas, which is the project in Honduras for EDC. They did have some multinational corporations, fast food restaurants, things like Church Chicken, Burger King, that sort of thing. Then also small private sector companies as well.
Are there other? Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
So something that struck me from question 5 on the ideal traits across different work fields. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this right, but would it be a good interpretation to say that with the exception of extroversion, you'd have a better understanding of what employers' ideal soft skills are in business? So they don't seem to have a good idea in production and direct service, but I feel like in business, they seem to have a better sense of what employers want, except for extroversion. And it seems very different to question 3 when we look across the board. Do youth fulfill employers' ideals? So if we compare a youth ideal employee versus employer's ideal employee. So I just wonder if that's the right interpretation and why would that be the case?
Gabriel, did you hear that?
Yes, I'm not sure how to interpret the findings. There might be other effects involved. So, for example, this youth that work or want to work in business just have a higher self-esteem and rated themselves higher on many traits. That might be a possible explanation. So it's hard to tell, but as we can see, yes, if we look at the findings, yes, the youth in business rated rated both their self and their ideal highest. And that's why it's closer to the ideal employee. But why that is, I can't say for certain.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a really, really great question. It would be, yeah. Any other questions, or can we move into the? Okay, great. So, can you group yourselves roughly into groups of 5 or fewer? And then we'll go to the charts and just keep moving through charts as you at your group's pace. And I'll call time probably in about 15 or 20 minutes. And at that moment, I'll ask you whatever chart you're at to spend a couple of minutes processing all the information so that you can then present it back to the group before we join up again and talk about a couple of other questions to bring all the data together. All right.
Herding approach.
The 6 is down there on the end of the table.
So the study was included students who
I'm not sure.
so it wasn't necessarily a student that maybe didn't have a student.
Right, yeah, there's an extra.
Yeah, that's it, okay, thank you.
Sure. One more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ideals. And the finding is that youth self-ratings and the youth ideals fall below employer ideals, particularly for all but openness. And then why do you think this relationship exists? And the notes were that youth, who are mostly students, have never experienced these skills acting out in the workplace. And maybe they don't know or understand their value, although there's a little note that they have received workforce training.
Yeah, so let me clarify really quickly. We had this 3-country sample, and all of the youth in all 3 countries had received at least our foundational work readiness training. Beyond that, there were dissimilarities in where they were in their training, but they all had at least completed that foundational training. So, yeah.
And sorry, did that training include an apprenticeship or?
No. So, yes, exactly. So some of them who went beyond that foundational training might have gone through that work-based learning element, but not all had. They'd only all received that in classroom training. Yeah, good question.
And I just wanted to note that in the group I was in, it was brought up that, sometimes if the youth go through the training, then they get a better understanding of what these skills actually are and then rate themselves lower because they gain that understanding. I think you shared that. And then the second point was that youth are still developing these skills, maybe don't understand their efficiencies or values. And then some questions off of that. Are some skills developed later? And then is there a gender difference? They're still interested in this.
It's good to know. Great, we can do that. Great, thank you. Any comments about this particular question? A lot of you wrote off well. Thanks, guys. Let's go on to the next one. How do you compare to their own ideals?
Okay, so there's a couple of comments here. The theory that was brought up in the presentation that youth may value their own skills highly based on their experiences of their own efficiencies. Also a comment about the training, so that youth may want to show that they have learned the ideal skills after the training that they've gone through. There's also a note that in the survey, the ideal questions are asked first to get the best data possible, since that was really the purpose of the study. And then we also had a comment that maybe if youth don't understand the skills very well, maybe they've gotten some initial understanding of them, but they haven't like fully internalized them, their ratings of themselves might be closer to ideal. It was just a hypothesis, another hypothesis.
Anyone want to contribute to that one? This is a really complex issue for me because, I mean, we're surveying youth, you know, and your assessment of yourself sometimes changes across time or on a particular day, and so I think a lot about this question, particularly the things people are bringing up that center around bias. Was there any kind of bias in the data? How are you responding? Do they understand the skills? And I think it's a big question, and one that this study certainly can't answer, but one that if somebody could answer, it would be really helpful to know what is the problem of a self-perception piece. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. It's just now.
Okay. So this was, do employers and educators look for different traits in youth? The finding was that both employers and educators value conscientiousness and emotional stability, while educators value openness more than employers, and employers value agreeableness and extroversion more than educators. So there are a couple comments. One, that in one way it makes sense that educators value openness, because we're thinking about creativity, critical thinking, which are all important to learning new things. But we were talking about how in many places where rote learning systems are the rule, that's also kind of a contradiction, because you'd imagine that openness isn't valued, but you expect to do what you tell them to do. And then for employers valuing agreeableness makes sense in terms of wanting employees to comply, be forthcoming, being honest, working in teams. Agreeableness would make a lot of sense that they would value that more because of those desiring those traits.
Anyone want to? It's a really interesting point that resonates with me about we work in contexts where there are a lot of rote learning systems where things are not learner-centered, so that openness is an interesting one in that context. That openness is valued.
I just also add there's a generational distinction also in some countries where rote learning was the employer perhaps that you've interviewed, that generation, versus the young person who's in a different world today.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Question. Has this type of work been done in the States? I assume it has, just looking at how it rates in terms of ground truthing someplace where we are coming from against other countries, kind of to understand, give us more context on some questions. Well, I just look at whether these have been done in the United States, and then as we look at this, being able to compare from our own experiences and our own understanding of these words, these terminologies, these relationships, as we look at another context. Just what the data looks like.
That's a good question. I don't know that people have. I don't think people have used this particular test to look at ideals in the U.S. Gabriel would know more about this than I. Gabriel, are you there?
Hi. Yes, I don't know of any study using that assessment in the US.
That's a good point you bring up about creation here.
Relationships between employers and youth.
I think, just to add to that, to the previous point, I think the generational factor is an interesting one to consider, because inherently you have different generations being consulted. And so with that comes different priorities about values and about what's important in the workplace, different understandings of that might be reflective of their age, but also might be reflective of the different industries and different patterns in employability. And so it's an interesting thing to consider. Obviously, the implications are still there because the hiring does happen in that way. But that sort of internal perspective could be something to triangulate with another study or somewhat to see if there is something there.
Thank you. What's the next?
This one talked about the question of do youth fulfill educators' ideals? And finding here was that youth self-ratings and ideals fall below the ideals provided by educators, particularly for openness, emotional stability, and conscientiousness. And why do we think this relationship exists? I think similar to the comments that were made previously, that here we found perhaps that educators were projecting more of an exaggerated or ideal vision of what they could do for their students, but within a system where those traits aren't necessarily promoted or encouraged, and the students are maybe actually indicating what the actual reality is within the classroom, those types of traits and skills that are actually trying to promote it or build up. There was a question from a previous group, or at least a comment that seems that educators have lower expectations for youth on extroversion and agreeableness. Why? I think, well, we did, I don't know if there's someone else who made this comment, but we didn't find this to be necessarily true, or the gap was insignificant, so I answer that. And then we did have a question here on were these the same were the educators TVET and secondary school level? I think a later question. If someone was working on this question earlier about the educators.
Yeah, so I can clarify. So what we meant was that educators' expectations were lower for extroversion and agreeableness than for the other traits. So not between youth ratings and educator ratings, because they are very similar and like statistically the same for agreeableness. But we were wondering, like, why are they lower? So agreeableness is so much lower than it's lower than conscientiousness, for example. So I thought that was interesting. Why might these be less valued by educators?
I mean, I had an idea, and that is that perhaps these are things that you can't actually teach. So you can't teach extroversion. Maybe encourage it, but and also no agreeableness. Maybe you could through some team building, but again, if you're in these rote learning systems, it's not really. Right.
I just, if I guess, if educators perceive that they can't influence it, maybe they don't value it. I would agree.
So this was, do ideal traits differ across different work fields? The findings are that employers have higher requirements for emotional stability and extroversion for direct service jobs. They have the lowest requirements for production jobs, and youth scores were highest for youth who worked in or wanted to work in business, and lowest for production-related work. Why do we think this is so? So we had a lot of different ideas about where this might be coming from. The first comment was really background, so youth background, TVET versus academic, influence their personal perceptions and social status regarding the occupation. So production jobs as opposed to business, for example. TVET trained youth are likely to pursue production jobs instead of business. And then sort of what they've learned about those jobs or what they perceive as valued in those jobs. So production jobs are typically not client-facing, so we think that emotional stability and extroversion might not be so demanded by employers. Self-esteem or perceived self-esteem of profession amongst employers in business or direct service would be higher than employers in other work fields. Same could be said of youth in business. you seem to have better understanding of the ideals in business, maybe because the business employers have done a better job communicating what they value in those youth. And then what youth are taught or trained on. So if they're trained on workforce readiness, maybe they're taught what are these different values in these different fields, and that could influence their perception. So what youth are taught or trained on in relation to different fields or occupations, there's more or less emphasis on them. The size and type of the companies may explain the traits that are considered ideal, and youth may self-select occupations they already have ideal traits for. And we had some questions about sort of unpacking these different industries. So like, there's a question about, is agriculture considered production? How are these different industries grouped? What were the services or businesses considered? And then what were they taught about these businesses in the training? Could influence all these different perceptions.
That's a really good point. The piece I think that is really important for our research is the training that they got. And I don't know if they were taught differently based on any particular work field, but that is a really important piece for us to find out and add into like a background section, I think, on the report.
In our experience, when we do labor market assessments, where we go and interview youth about, precisely the sort of questions where we keep it open questions like, what soft skills do you value in new employees? Employers have a very hard time articulating what they want. And actually, sometimes they, especially production employers, they might think that, or in that manufacturing, they might think that soft skills are not important, but then when you get into the details, it turns out that they do value it. But if you just ask them like at face value, like, are soft skills important to you, and you try to extract like, what do you mean by soft skills? It's very hard for them to really articulate that. I don't know if that varies across sectors, but I think it might. So I wonder if, how were employers asked those questions, and did you also see that? Because we're seeing that there is a difference between youth ideal preferences and employers, but we don't want to make a claim whether youth are wrong and employers are right? It's also like, are employers really understanding these questions as well?
Or just like emotional intelligence, where, if you don't have the vocabulary, it's hard to describe exactly how you're feeling. So it's almost like you need a sort of a map to say, no, this is the skill I need.
Yeah. The benefit of the BFI is that it asks these questions without ever mentioning the big words that we're talking about, like emotional stability or conscientiousness, or even the facets of each of those skills, which are things like communication or teamwork or self-control. The questions are more like, on a 5-point scale, tell me how much you agree or disagree that the ideal employee is talkative, or is punctual, or is whatever.
Full of energy.
Oh yeah.
Can be tense, has a forgiving nature, tends to be disorganized, tends to be lazy, is inventive. So these are kind of things.
And then you analyze those together in an index, to come up for each of the different 5 factors. So that is still something I want to think about, though. I think this is a little easier for an employer to sit down and rate than to say, do you value, but at the same time, it's a good point that when they sit down to think about it, are they thinking about what they really want on the manufacturing plant floor or whatever? Because go ahead.
Well, also to your point before about youth changing over time, I'm sure employers are the same too, right? If you have a particularly bad day with an employee, yes, I want them to be punctual, and that can change in terms of just your day and experience and where you are at the moment. So.
And that's a really good point, especially since you see how long the BFI is. It's 44 questions, so they're reliable sets for each of the big 5, and when we add the anchoring vignettes, they get more reliable. But you still don't know if there's what, like 9 questions to a factor, you know what I mean, that measures this factor that actually encompasses a wide range of activity and action. So yes, who knows if we're picking up on weird variations that have other influences.
Question maybe I should ask hour or so ago around the study in the countries and looking at markets and labor markets. Those three countries are very different. So a young person sees maybe in Rwanda agriculture and actually entrepreneurship around agriculture because of the limited labor market, or capacity labor market, might be completely different from someone in Honduras or Philippines. How that factors into how they respond.
I think we can move on to the final.
Okay, so this question is, do ideal traits differ for TVET students and general secondary students? And the findings were that educators' ideals are similar across school types. Youth self-ratings and ideals are systematically higher, though, in general school. So there are a couple of points made here. One group made the point that there's a stigma and global bias against TVET, and perceptions of types of jobs, such as white collar versus blue collar, can come into play in these ratings. Another couple of questions here. General educational level of TVET students might affect the way that they're responding. What TVET students are told is expected of them could come into play here. Confidence levels based on where students or youth responding are in their education, age differences, gender differences, country differences, level of violence. All of these things could affect their responses. I think as our group was looking at this question, one thought we wanted to kind of add on to this first point around stigma and global bias against TVET is that holds in terms of the youth self-ratings, because the youth self-ratings were higher for general school than for TVET. But the educator ideals are actually pretty similar across the school types, and so why might that bias be playing out for youth and not for educators? That was kind of the question that we were posing, and there could be many reasons why. Maybe it's generational differences, maybe it's, teachers perceive their own occupation as being prestigious regardless of whether they're teaching TVET or general. Just speculating on kind of what some of the reasons for why this kind of stigma point may not hold for educators could be.
I used to be an English teacher, and I would have thought with anybody in the most practical subject to say that English is so important and it builds all these really important skills, and it is important, but it's to your point, but it doesn't build all the skills. But I would have argued, because it was my subject, that this is really important and it builds all these skills. So I just really appreciate that point, that an educator might think that because this is what I teach and I see the value of it, it builds all these skills, and all these skills are important to succeed in it because it's their subject. That's really. Anyone else? So we are running a little bit low on time, but the last two questions that I want to think about now are, we've talked about all these different findings. Gabriel and Annie have shared the findings and the study. Now I just want to think, before we go, and for just a few minutes, what do these findings mean for our project implementation? So many of us work either as, on our programs or with our programs at our companies. So what do these findings mean for program implementation? And what also do they mean for further research? So we don't have to go in any order. If you have anything to say, please share. We'll just spend a few minutes on this. Okay, great. So any kind of closing thoughts? What does this mean for how we implement projects? What can it mean for the research that we do?
My first immediate thought is that this is the kind of work that I think could obviously inform how training is done. But so if you, obviously there are a lot of training programs that already do survey employers and educators about what they feel are the priorities, and then try to cater training around that. I think the biggest value add with including the youth's perspective is actually presenting this back to them as training begins and allowing them to understand where their expectations might differ from employers. Because, I think as a youth, you might come into a training process with your own expectations about the areas that you need to improve on, but being aware of those areas where employers really focus on, or educators really feel like the skills that are particularly important for particular sectors or fields, that can really allow students to prioritize what they do. That can allow them to perhaps push a little harder in a particular competency that they might not have prioritized before. And so I think it does obviously inform the way that we do training, but it also is a nice mirror to show back to you so that they can have an awareness of how to most effectively leverage their training, so that they're able to meet those needs.
I would say that these skills requires a lot of drilling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not something that you can learn in 10 weeks. And so what can we do working with early childhood education, parents? If we know that these are the skills that people really need to succeed as adults, then we need to start really early instilling those skills.
I think on the employer side, the thing that might also be useful is that the employers really understand what's behind the five. Because I think obviously the ones that went through the survey, they have filled this out. But I think if we were to look at job descriptions that they might put out for new positions or interview questions that they're using, they're probably not reflecting most of what's in there. And so I think helping even employers to do better hiring by understanding what those skills really represent. And then perhaps helping them also, how can that be reflected in their own internal trainings, but also even already in the interview process and the selection process.
Highlighting that these are skills which we would like to have when they make adults. It's one of its training, but one of its process. And so one of the things I focus on is looking at clubs as a mechanism for developing these skills, highlighting leadership development, expressing yourself through clubs, because you're not going to be able to do it through formal education. And so really focusing on how a club works, how it functions, as well as the content. So it's not just about training, it's how you deliver it. And there hasn't been a lot of work, I've looked a little bit on it now, but looking at how do you implement a club that develops these life skills, having that be as well as so you can do these things through a soccer club or an agriculture club, but looking at what is your root things you want to develop by being part of a club. I actually worked Peace Corps right now developing a club manual, and it hasn't. I've never really seen something really articulate how to run a club. I mean, how to start a club, but not actually how do you develop some of these skills, these life skills through a club.
Thank you.
I think the service learning project is to do the same thing, or at least attempt to do the same thing. My comment is actually suggested further research about what's been said so far. Have you discussed the possibility of having young people lead all of this, from the research, the gathering, the delivery of the questions, analysis, and then the dissemination? The dissemination piece is really important across the various spoke groups, right? The other young people, employers, educators, so that they start validating, self-validating with themselves and with for their future school, employment, employers. I'm just thinking I've seen this done in other programs, and it's quite powerful, and it allows, I think, a rapid uptake of some of this data and information processing.
So we are delivering focus group discussions next. and part of that is looking at the data with them and processing it. But it doesn't get quite to the level of what I actually think you're talking about, so it's really helpful. We'll get some of their reactions to what we found, but it won't be like going through it piece by piece.
So a young person asking these questions to another young person, the way they respond to it is quite different.
You're saying
Have the process, yeah, I mean, I know you're sort of the train's left the station, but I'm just sort of thinking in terms of, I don't know what further research is looking like in this program, but it might be interesting to think about that approach if it's not.
Could you use youth as the facilitators of the focus group discussions?
And design of the questions, and obviously they need others' experience supporting, but and they gather along the way a lot of the scope we're talking about.
Or perhaps another way could be for the dissemination purpose, if the youth first goes through the focus group discussions, and if there are then meetings with employers, that the youth actually present the results in the employer meetings or in the educator meetings.
I think the photography to have a showcase was led by the youth.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it has a gallery event at the end where they'll share.
That's going to be shared with employers?
Yeah, so invited. So we're not there yet, but the plan is to invite to that the adults involved in the study, local, the people who have relationships in the project, like local officials. Youth will be able to share the photographs that they took of which soft skills and explain them in that context. But not every youth. Our sample was for the quantitative study was over 300. Over 300. And for the focus group discussions, it's 40 per country, so 120. And the photography event much smaller to handle the quantity of data. Any final? Oh, sorry. Did you have?
Well, it's not so much further research, but I think it would be helpful in whatever output comes out of this if you can comment on how transferable you think these findings are to other country contexts. And I wonder if you might be able to get some of that through. Are you doing focus groups with the employers and educators as well?
No, just the youth.
Yeah, I just wonder if they might be able. I mean, the youth certainly, but also the employers and educators might be able to help tease out some of these mechanisms that might be driving some of these findings. And I think the more you can comment on that, so that people can understand where else we might be able to apply these findings. Or if we can't apply it to other contexts, just be clear about that as well.
I think I'm going to hand this back over to you, but I just want to say thank you to everybody. It's not often when you do a piece of research that you get to sit down with a lot of other people in your field, not just at your company, and process it together and think about what it could mean, especially when you're still in the middle of it and still have some more data collection activities to come. So just a really big thank you for participating and sharing your thoughts. Oh, you're welcome to contact us. I have my business cards here, or Gabriel or Annie. We'd all be really happy to engage with you if you leave here and you think, oh, I have this great idea for them or this question that is still unanswered. Please feel free to email myself, and I know Annie's and Gabriel's email addresses are not here, but I'm happy to share their email addresses with you, and I can share my card. So thank you all so much.
And I think from a YouthPower Learning perspective, I think it's also not often that researchers are willing to share their partial results with everybody for discussion. So
maybe there's a reason
also,
for that.
But I think we really appreciate that you did that, because I hope that it will also make your analysis easier and richer, and it's definitely appreciated.
Great. I want to give Annie and Gabriel, who are still on the line, any chance if they'd like to add anything before we move on.
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Annie, are you still on?
Hi, everyone. Just want to say thank you, and that looking forward to having the full results and the focus group discussions, and we'll be in touch to continue learning. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Annie, and thank you, Rebecca, for facilitating that. I think what we saw today was a really exciting use of the COP mechanism. So it's really what we always sort of dreamed of, is having people come together to not only sort of discuss and daydream about what we could do in this field, but also get our hands dirty a little bit and look at some research that's being done and provide our insights. And so I think this is a really great use of that. And want to segue to just talk a little bit more about what we'll be doing with the COP going forward, and looking for other opportunities to do something like this again. And so I think, unfortunately, my slide's being cut off a little bit short again, but looking ahead, we have a number of new activities for the new year. We will continue holding in-person events. We already had the one in December with Youth Power Action, this one with EDC, and I think have been talking, Rebecca and others in EDC, about at some point getting folks together again for this research as well. And so I think there's potential for that in the future. But we will be organizing other in-person events this year, and so keep an eye on our listserv for that. One thing that we'd like to ask you about is if there are similar activities and research that you like, workshops like this, please let us know. We'd love to provide the service of being a convener and having everyone contribute to your work as well. So EDC's work that's being done through the grants under contract is particularly dear to us because it's sort of going through the Youth Power Learning GUC mechanism, but I think we really welcome any other work that you'd like to workshop with us. In addition to the in-person events and workshops, we have a few learning events coming up, and so these are sort of broader and more open to the public, not just our COP membership. We have a webinar that's upcoming on skills development and economic opportunity for young women. That's happening on March 7th, and this happening alongside the week of International Women's Day, and so we're sort of leveraging that momentum to get a conversation going about women, skills, and employability and economic empowerment. That same week, some of the folks in this room are going to be presenting a panel at the CIES conference in Atlanta, and that one is focused on skills development for youth in challenging contexts. And so, unfortunately, if you're not going to be in Atlanta, I'm not sure if they're webcasting it or something like that, but we can definitely thinking about ways of sharing that presentation after the fact and making sure that it's accessible to folks who won't be there in person. And then finally, we also have an upcoming webinar on financing skills programs for youth employability. And so, similar to our targeting, recruiting, and retaining youth webinar, this is sort of looking at a niche topic in program implementation, and this particular one is focused on different sort of interesting and creative ways to finance youth skills programs, recognizing that youth skills programs don't always count with resources that they can, sustainable resources from youth themselves in terms of fees and ways that they can pay for it. This is looking at programs that do so sort of creatively. And so that's going to be happening the week of March 14th. And then finally, a big ask for you all, and something we want to brainstorm further, is just like the RFA that we put out that EDC has responded to and is working on, we like to develop some new ideas for further grants under contract. And so I think we'll be reaching out to COP members in the near future to really come together again and brainstorm what's the next step for us, what is the next project that we want to work on together, and we'd really welcome all of your input on that. Finally, some other activities that we really want to promote is we really want the COP to be an avenue for members to promote their work. And so if there are particular projects that you like to speak on, if there are presentations that you like to share with the whole COP, if you'd like to write a blog about a particular project or a finding that you have, we really welcome that, and we're here for you in order to help you do that. And so if it's a matter of coming to us and asking what the best way to disseminate that is, or asking us to partner with you on a blog, these are all things that we're here for. So we really welcome that, that type of activity. I think looking forward, just to take a broader look, really we want to make sure that this year goes beyond, just sort of our own internal conversations, but that is really leveraged to support and promote and expand on the work that you all are doing. And so we really look forward to crowdsourcing resources, events, and and opportunities through the COP Google group, also through the youthpower.org website and the YouthPower newsletter. So I think, the plug for us is if you come across resources that you think the broader community are interested in, events, opportunities for the broader community, please feel free to share those directly through the listserv and or with ourselves, the COP champions, so that we can promote those externally. We're looking forward to some other public ways of promoting this work and every COP member's work, including Twitter chats and other social media engagement. And again, as we mentioned on our COP listserv, we're really looking forward to some blogs coming in so that we can really dive a little bit deeper into some of the work that you're doing and promote that to a broader audience. So that's it. That's all we have for today in terms of our looking forward. We wanted to save some time at the end for networking and so folks can chat a little bit more and grab some more fruit and pastries. But first, I wanted to open up the floor to see if there's anyone who wants to share or give us an update about what you're working on currently. If there are any sort of projects that you're really excited about, if there's anything that you feel could fit into any of these formats that we have for sharing the work, workshops, webinars, if there's anything like that that you feel you can marry to our COP processes, let us know. And if you'd like to provide an update now for the room and sort of provide some background on what you're doing, we'd welcome that. I'm going to start with Cassandra, who raised her hand for.
Thank you. Just to sort of extend what Daniel was saying, and wanted to particularly mention youthpower.org. It is the website for thinking about positive youth development, youth engagement. You're able to join the exchange and post yourself directly. You're able to email us directly, and we can help post for you, whether it's events, resources, do blogs, get in our newsletter. It is your resource, and so really want to encourage you to do things, whether you're in YouthPower, outside of YouthPower, that doesn't matter. It's really about youth programming, positive youth development, cross-sectoral, holistic elements associated with supporting youth. So quick plug there. Also just wanted to mention, and all of you would have received this, I think, in your inboxes, but we do have the newly released positive youth development measurement toolkit we were super excited about. We did an initial training. We'll be getting that up online. So if you wanted to actually sort of listen to some elements of it and getting a bit more of a deeper dive, you can do that. You can download the whole document. You can look at sections of it. In the next day or so, we'll get up online just the illustrative indicators, like as a proper handout, and those will be starting to circulate in different public forums. So just mentioning that's there, and soon to come, and Danielle and colleagues have been working on that, a meta review or a systematic review on positive youth development in low and middle income countries. What works? What have we seen? What's been the outcome and impact? Stay tuned, weeks away. So.
Yes.
Hi, I'd like to share, so I'm Andrea from Save the Children. I'd like to share a research that we're working on now that I'm really excited about. Results, we don't have results yet, but there will be expected by July this year. So we're actually testing whether we should integrate a financial capability component into our youth employment program, which is basically we work with youth to deliver employability skills training or soft skills training. But we want to know whether we're testing experimentally for an RCT, whether we should integrate financial capability. When I say financial capability, is this financial education plus giving youth access to a platform where they can practice the skills that they need. So we're trying this out in Vietnam, and we're going to replicate the study in Indonesia. And what excites us about this is that this platform where youth can practice saving skills and saving goals and track their savings is in Vietnam it's via social media, and in Indonesia we're actually developing a mobile application to do this. So we will have results to share by June this year for Vietnam, and Indonesia hopefully end of the year. But we would love to share more, perhaps preliminary or information about the research design for that.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
If people would be interested in the tools that we're developing at clubs, it would be, I can check to see if it's being done under Cross-Sectoral, so I just have to kind of see where they're navigating processes, but that might be something that you just,
yeah.
Sort of connected to the club concept I mentioned in our call later today, but I'll mention it to everybody, is under one of our other communities of practice, the youth engagement community of practice, we've been doing a video series and looking at youth engagement. The one around clubs, there's the CoP Learning Centers based in Uganda, and they're basically doing a year in the life of the club. So they started up a youth-led service learning club and are going from conception and through the year, and so looking at not just how do you set it up, but how do you manage it, how do you run it, how do you learn. So
I think that came out of some of the work Peace Corps was doing as well. We helped host a large gathering of all the youth of this type of work. So it's probably.
And we do have Katie Fox as a Peace Corps volunteer in Uganda, is working closely with YouthPower Center. So it is, it's wonderful.
Okay.
So I can speak for what we've been doing at FHI 360 Power Action. So as Daniel mentioned, we presented on a couple of different research studies that we've been working on over the past year in December. Currently in final review is our review of measurement tools on soft skills, and we'll be producing or publishing an inventory of those tools so that people can search it and find useful characteristics on all of those, as well as our paper on guiding principles for soft skills development, and we'll certainly work with to get this on YouthPower.org. Along with that, we are building on the work that we've been doing to inventory these soft skills measures to develop a measurement tool focusing initially on 3 skills that we found to be particularly important across multiple sectors. And those are positive self-concept, higher order thinking skills, and self-control. And those are also all reflected to some extent in the UFI. So that's really exciting work. We'll be working on that over the next fiscal year. Certainly we'll share more as the tool progresses.
That's exciting. Yeah, I feel like there are a couple potential workshop opportunities there as well once you have drafts of that. Great. Share. You don't have to share now. Forever keep your peace. So the point of this is that we want to continue this conversation. So really thankful for everyone that has shared so far. If anything comes up later, please feel free to let us know. And I think we really want to keep this conversation going. So we are available, Radhika, Caitlin, Shubha, and I. I think everyone probably has our contact information, but if you don't, please come see us and we'll provide you that so that we can continue facilitating the interaction and conversation with folks. And then I've also, Rebecca, put up your side with their with your email. So if anybody has any further questions for the folks at EDC, please let them know. And I think if there are no other comments, I think we'll wrap up. We have 15 minutes, and we have this room for a little bit longer even, so feel free to linger and eat pastries before we put them out for the kitchen vultures. Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye everyone online. We'll be logging off now.
Bye.
Oh.